Hello and welcome back to another episode of On the Beaten Track. I'm your host, Rihanna. We are doing a daytime record with just the light from outside, so I hope that's good. You can see we've had a color change. They were fixing what had burnt, and I thought I was picking the pink that I had before. I came back from a hike and I was like, that's not pink. My husband hates it. His mother loves it. I think it looks great. I'm doing the daytime record because it is hot in Cape Town. In my little recording area, it is hot. And me being under lights is just going to make a whole lot of stuff happen that we don't want to. Thank you all for joining. Thanks for coming back. Last week, we unpacked some of those laws and we really dug into the past law. And this week, we go back to 1948 South Africa. The National Party swept into power promising apartheid. That's what they won on, a policy of separation of control of fear. Within months, the government passed one of the most insidious laws in modern history, the Population Registration Act. This is no ordinary law. It wasn't about safety or education or infrastructure. It was about turning human identity into paper, into categories, and into control. Every South African was classified white, native, colored, or Indian. Native had it was native, then it was Bantu, then it was African. This classification would determine every aspect of their lives. It laid the administrative foundation for apartheid. Apartheid, apartness. Now imagine you walking into a government office. There's two officials sitting there. They examine you from head to toe, your hair, your eyes, your skin, even how you spoke, your accent, your friends, your habits, your neighborhood, everything mattered. This wasn't scientific, let's be honest. It was arbitrary, humiliating, and cruel. What did I say? Cruelty is always the purpose. Language could determine your race. If you spoke Afrikaans or English fluently, you might be white or colored. You speak Xhosa or Zulu, you likely black. Just because people don't speak languages outside of their home language. Okay. Your customs, dress, and food, and who a person associated with, which is family, friends, communities, those were all scrutinized. Where you lived could shift your classification. A child in a colored neighborhood might automatically be considered colored, no matter their ancestry. Hair texture, y'all know. I spoke about my hair journey and I touched on this a bit in that episode on the fourth episode, which I'll link down below. Hair texture became symbolic oppression. We spoke about the infamous pencil test. If a pencil slipped through your hair, you might be white. If it was stuck, your hair was kroes, and your life would be forever different. The ridiculousness of it, especially with colored people. Go watch that episode. This was not a biological test like DNA. It was symbolic of how arbitrary and humiliating the process was. The shade of a person's skin was often judged subjectively under different lighting. People who were reclassified were often lighter skinned than people classified colored from birth. People in white professions, which were teachers and office workers, or with higher education, were sometimes just presumed to be white, or at least not black. Working class jobs would imply non-white. Classifications often depended on rumors or community perception. Remember when we say people telling on each other? What people thought you were, or what they told the officials. Neighbors, employers, or even stranger could file objections against what race you were classified as, and trigger an investigation. The system itself was inconsistent. The same person could be classified differently in different provinces by different officials. Like a survivor said, I remember my sister and we were twins, almost identical. But because my hair was curly or curlier, I was classified as colored. She was white. Now imagine growing up split like that. I have curly hair. My sister has straight black hair. These classifications were recorded in your identity card we spoke about last week. The dompas, or Afrikaners call it the stupid pass. Classification wasn't a one-time event. The state could reclassify you at any moment, turning lives upside down overnight. Reclassification often occurred because of appearance changes. So children would have been classified as something younger. They grow up, they either become darker or lighter than expected. Marriage or relationship, so loving somebody of another classification could trigger an audit. It's time for all of this. Neighborhoods, moving to a different neighborhood could invite investigation. A promotion to a white-dominated profession might trigger a suspicion. As a survivor from East London in the 1970s said, I was born colored. I worked as a shop manager in a colored area. I married a colored woman. One day, officials said I wasn't colored enough. They reclassified me to black. My wife was then charged under the Immorality Act. We had to fight just to live. Entire families were split. Siblings, parents, and children classified differently. Some were uplifted temporarily. When I say uplifted, they were moving from black to colored or colored to white for access to better schools or jobs, only to be reclassified again later. Others were demoted, losing privileges, being forced into locations or townships designated for a lower racial group or category. Sandra Lange, born white but reclassified as colored, became an iconic example. Mission orphans such as St. Philip's in Grahamstown, they frequently reclassified children of mixed ancestry, stripping them of their birth certificates, the tongue, and family ties. As a survivor from Uppington, a Griqua elder said, I was taught one thing at home, told another at school. My siblings were classified differently. You had to choose who you were, sometimes even hiding your real family. Just how devastating this is. This constant state surveillance created a climate of fear and mistrust. Families had to navigate reclassification carefully, who they married, where they lived, and even how they dressed. The colored category became especially unstable. You look at colored people today, do you think you could bucket them? You can't. With people moving in and out of that classification based on appearance, language, and even rumors. Many attempted to pass as a higher status race for safety or opportunity, which I spoke about earlier. But the psychological cost was immense. The guilt, the shame, and anxiety became where you felt daily. You could be reclassified at any stage, and that higher race privilege will be taken away immediately. So let's talk about Sandra Lange. Reclassification and the cruelty of it is really encompassed in what happened to this little girl, because it happened when she was little. She was born to white parents, but she had dark skin and tightly curled hair. By the age of 10, at an all-white school, parents complained that she looked colored. Now tell me, what would have mattered? Okay. The authorities intervened, and despite her ancestry, which I think they later looked into, I think they might have even done like a DNA test, and that was her father and that was her mother. Despite that, she was reclassified as colored. Now what? Her parents are white, she's classified as colored. What happens now? She was expelled from school. Can't be here. We're separate. We're apart. She was ostracized by her family's community. Her parents fought unsuccessfully to get her reclassified as white again. A process that exposed the absurdity and cruelty of the apartheid bureaucracy. In her teens, Sandra became isolated and confused about her identity. In her late teens, she fell in love with a colored man, Petrus Swane. Her father violently opposed the relationship, as interracial relationships were illegal under the Immorality Act, which is strange because she was classified as colored, so it wasn't an interracial relationship under what the law says, right? They eloped to Swaziland, which is now Eswatini, effectively cutting her off from her white family forever. She lived thereafter as a colored woman, and even though she was born and raised white, her father never forgave her and disinherited her, and her mother only reconciled with her later in life. Sandra lived most of her adult life in poverty. She raised her children as within the colored community, but she was never really fully accepted anywhere. When you look at a picture of her, I know she looks more colored. That is a gene coming through strong from that line, you know? After apartheid ended, Sandra sought legal recognition and family reconciliation, but you can imagine that the emotional scars were just there. I think that's when she reunited with her mother. Her story is a stark reminder that apartheid did not just separate people physically, it destroyed identity, love, and family. Now let's look at human consequences of classification and reclassification. Like I said before, it would determine where you lived. Whites grouped areas in city and suburbs. Coloreds and Indians had limited areas, often forcibly removed. And Africans had homelands or locations and later townships. Then your race determined which jobs you could hold. So white people were the only ones that could have skilled jobs and managerial posts. It determined which schools or universities you could attend, and also determined your wage scale, your voting rights, and your access to social services. I think that's still in place today. From the administrative and enforcement perspective, the Act required that it was compulsory for everyone to be registered. Each birth was recorded with a racial category. Reclassification boards, because we always have to have a board to enforce cruelty, they conducted interviews and tests. The tests. Officials could change a classification at any time, even against someone's will. By the 1970s, over 22 million people had been racially classified in South Africa. This act was really the bureaucratic heart of apartheid, the system that turned color into law, family into file, and humanity into categories. It reduced millions to administrative labels, erasing nuance, culture, and shared ancestry. Its abolishment in 1950 to 1991. That's 41 years that the act was there. That abolishment ended the paperwork of racism, but not its impact, its psychological and structural scars. For millions, the Population Registration Act was not about justice or administration. It was about erasure. Families were split apart, children classified differently from parents, names changed, languages forbidden, and spiritual practices oppressed. And try again. The Abdurrahman Alexander descendants in Cape Town, Islamic names forced to European alternatives, families in the Western Cape, siblings separated, some white, some colored, forbidden to maintain ties. Griqua and Khoisan communities, their ancestral names and languages erased to fit into the colored category. As a Griqua elder said, "My mother was called Elizabeth at school. Her real name was Idagob. When she died, she whispered it to me again, so someone could remember. The Ciskei border workers, these were black men working in Cape Town factories who had colored partners or spoke Afrikaans, were occasionally reclassified as colored to keep them in the Western Cape legally. That was especially common for Xhosa men with colored wives. For example, an African worker, James Mshlongo, married a colored woman in 1969. To avoid deportation back to the Ciskei homeland, he successfully applied for reclassification. He later described the process. I had to cut my family ties. They told me I must speak Afrikaans, not Xhosa. I became colored on paper, but not in my heart. Then children of African mothers and colored fathers, or vice versa, were placed in mission orphanages, were frequently reclassified to simplify state paperwork. Because colored schools and orphanages were less strictly segregated, many orphans of African ancestry were classified to fit into the system, to make it easier for them. That's what they did. In some cases, Black individuals intentionally classified or passed as colored to escape racial restrictions. But this was, if you can think about it, it's really dangerous and you're giving something up. So it's psychologically costing and taxing. There's a case of Moses of East London in the 1970s. A black man with a lighter skin passed as colored to work as a shop manager in a colored area. When discovered, he was charged under the Population Registration Act for misrepresentation of race. He was imprisoned, reclassified back to native, and his colored partner was charged under the Immorality Act for an interracial relationship. Just the same theme, cruel, taking people apart. Then off the UWC 1998 Oral History Project, there's a quote that says, I was born Xhosa. The government made me colored. I lost my clan name, my cousins, and my tongue, all to live in a place I could not call home. This wasn't just bureaucracy. It was psychological warfare designed to make people doubt themselves, their families, and their heritage. But let's talk about that psychological impact. In colored and Black communities, classification became a source of stigma and hierarchy. Even among the oppressed, people began internalizing apartheid's logic, believing that lighter skin or European ancestry meant that you were better. This internalized racism caused low self-esteem, body shaming because you had a discomfort with your hair, your skin tone, your accent, language anxiety, fear of speaking too Black or too white, imposter syndrome in mixed race individuals trying to fit in everywhere. The apartheid system engineered these feelings intentionally to destroy solidarity, to break community, right? An ANC activist said in 1997. It wasn't to separate us. They made us believe we were different even when we weren't. That psychological and social trauma left many wondering, who am I really? A survivor from East London in the 1970s said, I had to speak Afrikaans at work, Xhosa at home, and neither side knew the other. I didn't know where I belong. You really look at this chronic anxiety. You know, you have to look at your daily life. You have to be constantly vigilant for fear of inspection and fear of reclassification. The psychological, what is it that I'm looking for? Exhaustion. You know, you had double consciousness when you speak about what this person just said. Neither parts of me knew about each other. So you're living between legal identity and personal identity. Then we have attachment trauma because children were separated from their parents or siblings, suffering emotional scars that lasted for decades. A Cape Town teacher in 1996 said, "We were told to forget our grandparents' names, the language, the prayers, the songs. They said it was pagan. We didn't forget, we just hid it." Even generations later, families debate, are we really colored, African or white? This is what psychologists now call transgenerational identity trauma. Scars run deep on what this did to us. We look at the colored identity. When we look at through all of this, the colored identity became a paradox, right? So privilege compared to Native, Bantu, African, whatever they were calling them at that stage, yet excluded from whiteness. The apartheid then, because y'all know we got some mixing going on up in here, they decided to subdivide colored into more categories. Then you had Cape Malay, Cape Colored, Griqua, other colored. I feel like I'm missing one, but those were the ones, right? Using arbitrary markers like ancestry, language, and even food people. Families would, like I said, would make deliberate decisions to be classified higher in the hierarchy. So lighter skin, European ancestry, or passing as white offered access to better jobs, school, and social standing. We've gone through that. Marriage choices, hairstyles, and even cuisines were manipulated to gain advantage. A survivor from Oudtshoorn in the 1960s said, "We dyed our hair. We straightened it. We wore certain clothing. It felt like living in a lie. But not doing so meant that you were stuck at the bottom." Then from Colored, I've taken out some of Tessa Doom's quotes. Stick with me, it's a bit long, but really powerful. This is the birthplace of modern colored identities. Why modern? Because the Population Registration Act of 1950 did not invent coloredness. During the colonial era, people of so-called mixed racial descent were called kleurling, an Afrikaans word which directly translated means one with color or colored. Colored in both South Africa and America was not an affirmation of what a person was, but rather a reminder of what the person was not. Then she goes on to say, "Colored is not a name I gave myself or my community gave itself. The history of coloredness as a legal identity marker is of a name given to many communities through a process that often stripped away more than it offered." She just says it so beautifully. So this system forced people to evaluate themselves constantly, how they look, how they spoke, how they acted. So the social hierarchy penetrated into every aspect of life. Amid this oppression, teas built culture. If you think about it, there is a musicality, humor, language, and food that is distinctly colored, even though varied. When I think of my home growing up, and even now, I mean, my husband and I cook very differently, but when I think of my home, I think of curry, star and a seed. I think at some stage when we met, I was like, how do you cook with no masala? I don't understand. It doesn't taste of anything if there's no masala in it. It just felt wrong to the point that, I learned how to make cottage pie and lasagna, and I used to put masala in it, and my husband still likes it that way. Then you have like the staples, green bean stew, cabbage stew, cauliflower stew, borskos, which was a revelation when my mother pulled that one out in front of my husband. And he was like, "Oh my God, wait a minute. You have not made this for me." Still loves it. Dania, a must. Tomato smorky with fish and mash. Aardappelkoolblaar. kifayat kos. And then Sundays was your roast chicken with your pot of curry or a stew and your spinny veg of cauliflower, broccoli, and white sauce. I mean, these things are us. It's us, right? In Khaled, she says, Haiskos is the seat of memory for most cultures. It is not only in the recipes passed down from one generation to another, but in the flavors and aromas that bring connection and a sense of identity. You know, the olfactory memory is amazing. When my neighbor makes something, like the warmth and joy of smelling that is just something you can't replicate any other way. Then obviously we have the iconic Cape Town dish of the Gatsby. And that really came from, if I remember correctly, you know, low on food, just putting things together. We're just influenced by this blend that became pulled together under this categorization and forced into areas together. Then Tessa goes, it is my cultural experience of coloredness that makes it an identity I use easily and with pride. Colored is not my race. I do not identify colored because of the tone of my skin. Identify as colored because of shared practices, values, and experiences I have with the community that raised me and gave me a sense of belonging in this country. It is an identity that, despite its roots in violence, oppression, and pain, has come to mean more to me and many in the colored communities who raised me than a signifier that I do not qualify for being called white. Just absolutely beautifully said. It's exactly the way I feel about it. Despite apartheid's attempt to divide and erase, people created belonging, community, and shared identity. Coloredness became more than a legal category. It became a lived, cultural, human experience. So true. So let's reflect. The Population Act teaches us that bureaucracy can become a weapon of oppression. Identity is not just biological, it is cultural, community, and lived experience. The systems of classification can cause intergenerational trauma, shame, and social division. Remember Sandra Lange. The families torn apart, the children stripped of names, the communities that endured. This is the human cost of apartheid, not only in laws and policies, but in hearts, homes, and minds. Even when the law was repealed in 1991, the scars remained. Identity as a weapon cannot be easily undone. Said 41 years of this mindset, of this way of living cannot be switched in a moment just because it's been repelled. But by remembering, listening, and telling the stories, hopefully it becomes part of our healing and connects us to our identity different than what it was meant for. I remember you always classified at birth according to your father's classification. So my mother was Cape colored and my father was other colored. And therefore we were coded as other colored. Actually, my sister recently said she wasn't. So I don't know what happened there. But that term, other colored, broke my brain. It felt shameful. It felt hurtful. And as a kid, I was actually quite light skinned, but with curly hair and a sister that had straight black hair, kind of looks Indian. This other thing, this word uncolored made me feel incensed. It made me feel bad about myself, really bad about myself. And I hated it. I hated it. When they took it away, it felt like my brain stopped being on fire when I used to see that classification in my ID book. It just killed. If we look at my family, my mom, her dad was Cape Malay. Her mum, which I spoke about in the hair episode, was the result of a relationship between my mum's grandma and a white guy. My grand sisters, because then her mum got married to a Khoi man. Her sisters were super dark and more like the natural inhabitants of Oudtshoorn, where she's from. She was different looking than her sisters even. Then you had my dad, his mom. There is Chinese, there is Indian, there is the mix. Her surname is tied to the place in India where her family originated from. So she was an Assam, but in India it's pronounced Assum. I remember sitting on a boat somewhere, I think in Indonesia, and my husband went, "Oh, where were you from?" to these guys. And they're like, "Oh, we're from Assum." And Sasha just goes, "My wife's family's from there." And they look at me and I'm like, "Why do you do that? It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to these people." They're like looking at me like super confused. And I'm like, guys, it's generations ago, you know. Then my dad's dad was pale skin, white, blue eyes. Can't remember his hair color. I only got to know him later like when I was a teenager, I think. His parents are unknown. I've been meaning to go to the records office to go and kind of see if they have anything. But because they were in the Eastern Cape, I'm not really sure here in Cape Town if they would have records. But it's just speaking about my grandparents like that. We are not one color palette. So I have cousins that are every shade. White, milky, very dark, with green eyes, beautiful. And you go, how is this your first cousin? How is this your cousin? It's strange, but that's my family, right? So yeah, I mean, looking at my family already, you see this mix and you see how it's not one single ethnic group. Can't be. Looking at just those four people. So we were culturally, and I've used this in the past, a creolized community. We were forced together and we formed over centuries through the mixing of these diverse people during the colonial times and slavery at the Cape. Then with the taking away rights, then apartheid came and just kind of pushed us more together to create this creolized community. In the book Colored, it says, being colored has never simply been a matter of racial mixing. In the terms of the age-old nature versus nurture debate, coloredness is very definitely a matter of nurture over nature, characterized by relationships, geographies, language, fashion, sensibilities, and music. Mixed race is not colored. Don't know how else to say that. But whenever I travel, people are always like, so which one of your parents is white? I'm like, no, my parents are both colored. And their parents, which one of them is white? No, it's just colored mixing with, it is this mixture that then there's just a colored baseline that became, I guess. And they find it very complicated to understand, even though they are white and their parents are white and their parents' parents are white. So I'm not really sure why this is so hard. I think just using the term colored gets people's backs up and they don't understand the history and therefore they need to find a way to go, well, when did it mix? When did this mix happen? I need to know so that it clicks and makes sense in my mind, you know? We are the people between black and white. And we became a community. We were forced to identify each other even though we were of European descent. Others were of Malay slave descent. Then there were people who were descendants of the Nama. We also have it through the mix of people of Mozambique, Malagasy, Angolan and Ghanaian. Then they mix with each other, and then they were bucketed into the classification of colored. And thank you so much for joining and listening through this exploration of the Population Registration Act, what it meant, how it impacted people, how its long tail of its impact is still felt today. And people either wear their classification with pride or they want to do away with it. And for those who were reclassified and reclassified, there is an understanding about connecting with an identity that you were forced to lose. Next week, we'll talk about the Group Areas Act. And that was another nail in the coffin for the people of color in South Africa. Thank you for listening. If you're not subscribed, please subscribe. I see your subscriptions coming through. Thank you for all the comments on social. It's really great how much you guys are interacting with the content and loving it. I'm loving putting it out. It's heartbreaking something to explore, but really fulfilling for me some of these survivor stories, because that's what we are. We all survived this together. Thank you so much. Bye. And I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.